Hello, my name is Jeremy May, and today we're going to be taking a look at the topic of the Cuban Revolution. In particular, I'd like to take you through the book authored by Frank T. Fitzgerald, and it's titled The Cuban Revolution and Crisis, From Managing Socialism to Managing Survival. Before we get into the book itself, I'd like to go through a short overview through a PowerPoint of how the Cuban Revolution came to be and how Fidel Castro made his mark on it.
The Cuban Revolution was set to begin in 1959 when Fidel Castro and his rebel army had a failed attempt at Moncada barracks. Following this, he created his speech, "History Will Absolve Me," and was eventually pardoned and was exiled into Mexico. While in Mexico, he trained his rebel army, which prepared for guerrilla warfare against Batista and the rest of the Cuban government. Castro later returned to Cuba upon the ship Granma in December of 1956. He met Batista's soldiers on land, where they battled and Castro lost many of his men. Fortunately, him, along with some of his other leaders, were able to disperse themselves among Cuba, where they relied on peasants for support. Batista found this out and attacked the pro-Castro towns, but eventually this tactic led to more support for the rebel leader, Castro. Leaders such as Fidel and Raul Castro led battles against Batista's men throughout the revolution. They used guerrilla warfare, which Batista was not ready for, to defeat him upon his own land. Batista eventually, throughout years of fighting, rendered himself hopeless and fled to Spain. Castro eventually took the town of Havana and thus took the power as leader of Cuba.
Fitzgerald begins the book by taking us through the crisis that is the 1990s of Cuba under Fidel Castro. He talks about different signs of crisis. For example, things like crop yields are beginning to fall due to the lack of fertilizers and other nutrients. The hospitals are in great demand of equipment and medicine as they are getting many patients that they cannot just treat. And the public is really worrying about transportation, whereas oil and batteries are at an all-time low in Cuba, and they're not able to get around. Food has also become rationed within Cuba, and many people are resulting to vegetarian needs as they grow their own crops, or attempt to, because they don't have fertilizer. The U.S. blockade has been issued all over the island that is Cuba, and Cuba has entered the worst of its crisis. We see all of these different factors that Fitzgerald had mentioned coming into play due not only to the U.S. blockade all over Cuba, but also due to the collapse of the Soviet bloc communism associated with Cuba at the time. Cuba in the 70s had joined the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, titled CMEA, which would supply the country with favorable trade arrangements and assistance in all matters. The book speaks of how in the 70s, Cuba concentrated about 65% of the value of its total turnover with the socialist countries. Cuba had become all in at this point, and by the late 80s into the 90s, the Soviet bloc had proceeded with collapsing. People all over at this point began to speak of how the fall of the revolutionary government was upon them, as their sugar output was not as high as it once was, and the countries that were trading partners were asking for more while giving less. Moving on from the roots of the crisis itself, Fitzgerald goes into following his main theme throughout all the chapters. He describes it as being a study of the relationship in revolutionary Cuba between social stratification and the politics broadly conceived. It really pushes for the reader to focus in on the education system, the role of the new professionals, and the education system's effect upon the skilled workers in that time, that being the intermediate level workers. The time of Batista had left behind a very scarce and ineffective education system. Fitzgerald takes it as far as saying that it is misallocated, and scarce skills and skilled workers resulted directly from the poor educational system left behind. He talks of how the revolutionary leaders took control and looked towards economic development. They attempted to move away from the crutch that was the sugar at the time and towards other skilled works within agriculture and industry. The problem remained, though, that the education system had failed them and they lacked the skills they needed to do these jobs. Thus, one of the new government under Castro and the revolutionary leaders' first step was to expand and improve the education system. Fitzgerald talks of the literacy campaign, which Castro and Cuba pushed in the early 60s to increase and create awareness of the education program. Even with this step, economic stability did not come about directly from it, and the crisis hit an all-time high in 1970. Fitzgerald spends much of his time in the following chapters discussing the economical, political, structural, and social makeup that had come about during Castro's time in power. New professionals had entered the education system, a process that was labeled by Fitzgerald as rectification, and had in turn begun to push out what was the old regime. It became Castro and the revolutionary leaders' job to make this transition to the new professionals as smooth as possible for the people of Cuba. They had to discourage the old cadres, who were the workers that had kept their jobs even without the education process needed, from resisting the transition to the new professionals. The new professionals by this time were the ones that had entered intermediate level work following their education process to the secondary level. Fitzgerald moves into talking of how the government had to define the new roles of the professionals in his revolutionary goals. Conflict did come from the old regime, as Fitzgerald points out, and problems remain as the crisis still follows. So Castro made the step of declaring the rectification drive of 1986 in an effort to rectify economic practices and dig them out of the hole that they were once in. He concludes by speaking of how bureaucratic democracy had become spoken of within the area and that the political standing of Cuba had yet to still be declared. The collapse of the Soviet bloc made a lasting effect upon Cuba, and the U.S. blockade remained throughout these years that this book was written. In conclusion, the new professionals were overly important to the possible economic resolution that was to come for Cuba. Fitzgerald points this out as many times as he possibly can throughout almost every chapter, and how these new professionals played a large role in if they were going to become back to economic stability. Not much regarding the author, Mr. Frank T. Fitzgerald, is mentioned outside of what is mentioned in his book. He does thank his wife, Miss Pamela M. Robert, for her help along the way, as long as the help from the New York Library and the College of St. Rose Library. He mentions his previously written book, titled Managing Socialism, From Old Cadres to New Professionals in the Revolutionary Cuba, which was written in 1990, and how it follows the same principles of the one we have just went over. He states that the writing of the updated and somewhat different perspective of this book comes about because of the fall of the Soviet bloc communism which had happened since his writing of the first one in 1990. It seems that Fitzgerald has either a connection or a strong emotion about the exiting of the old regime and the entering of the new professionals. He discusses how many of his ideas for this book came from discussions with Cuban campaneros during his time spent in Cuba. I think that it is safe to say that Fitzgerald's writing falls within a political ideal while mainly focusing on the ideals of socialism and social change.
This book, written in 1994, has many ups and downs throughout it, where I myself as a reader at times became very intrigued, but also lost and confused as well. To begin, we will look at the strengths of the book and how I as a reader found it interesting and productive. To start off, anyone looking to learn or gain an interest in political and social standing of Cuba during this time will get exactly that from it. With the talk of socialism, bureaucratic democracy, and the role of the U.S. affairs throughout the book, you see a large amount of information on the economic struggle that is Cuba during this time. I also really enjoyed the discussion of the rise of new professionals and dismay of the old regime. This discussion kept me engaged in that I continued to wonder more how the new professionals would be incorporated. Fitzgerald did a good job of driving home this main theme of the new professionals' role on the hopeful economic rise of Cuba. He also spent a great deal of time in the education system and how it affected the professionals. I enjoyed this because it was a different view than the typical side you hear from a U.S. history class. It took a problem that had occurred during the crisis and turned it into a driving point for how it could push towards the eventual leaving of that crisis. As far as how it is written, the best move Fitzgerald made was leaving a section for key terms throughout the book. This allowed for readers who may not be as educated on the subject to gain an initial knowledge on what they are getting into. This book basically defines the word crisis and struggle for power through the informative information and standings in Cuba. As for the weaknesses, it comes down to basically the level of historian or reader at hand. The book seems to jump around a lot through a wider range of topics, although mostly focused on themes such as socialism, new professionals, Castro, and education. We see within one chapter alone a moving of topics from these four to structural and strategic reassessments, all the way to rectification. I believe that the chapters should be separated to a point where the reader is getting one topic or point of view to where they won't lose their task at hand. Along with this, there seems to be a theme of constant referral to the same words over and over. I appreciate a review and touching back upon specific themes, but I seem to read the word professionals 200 times throughout the book. In conclusion for the weaknesses, I see it as a tough read for many as the jumping around catches you off guard and the high-level political and social terms catch you wondering what was just said. In conclusion, I would recommend this book to someone who is really looking to dig deeper into what is the Cuban Revolution and how Cuba fared throughout it all. If you have a strong push to learn more about Cuba's economic crisis, Castro's deeper information beyond what is on the front page, and/or history in general, this book is for you. Besides that, I believe that anyone without this large interest should avoid this book. Although very informative and historically relevant to America, this book is a hard read to get through in that it becomes very wordy, dull, and confusing for one who does not have a large knowledge of the topic at hand. To a pleasure reader, it would be better fitted to look elsewhere.